We are still in Joshua chapter 7. Going to finish up a little bit of this chapter and go on to chapter 8. Talking about the battle of Ai and the sin of Achan. This kind of abrupt whiplash from what we saw in the previous lesson about the victory at Jericho. So just a brief recap. You get us all on the same page. They took Jericho with no problems whatsoever. God gave them the victory. The Ark of the Covenant and the priests go around the city each day. The walls fall down miraculously. The people are able to go up into the city and to destroy it. Everyone is feeling amazing about this, and they went on to Ai. And we noted some problems last week that Joshua doesn't seem to ask God where they're supposed to go next. They seem to be a little bit more concerned with their own power and the victory that they've had. And so God is quite absent at the beginning of chapter 7, at least in the minds of the Israelites. They go off to Ai. But they are defeated soundly because Achan had sinned in the battle at Jericho. It didn't stop the battle at Jericho. They were still able to defeat the city then. But it was at Ai that the problem is really revealed. And so this tiny force at Ai that was going to be a lot easier to take than Jericho ends up sending the Israelites scrambling. And they are not able to defeat them. 36 people die, and morale has tanked. Everyone is terrified. And when Joshua and the elders of the people have spent all day mourning, and then Joshua prays to God, basically asking God, why have you done this to us? Why have you abandoned us? What is going to happen to our name, and oh, by the way, your name as well? God tells Joshua, get up. There's sin in the camp. And one of the things that we talked about a little bit last week, but we maybe didn't elaborate enough on, was the fact that it's Achan's sin that makes the whole of the people of Israel the devoted thing for destruction. That's a theme here within this book of Joshua, that it's the sin even of one that becomes an impurity to the whole camp. And so I know we talked some last week on, did other people know about this? Did other people commit the same sin that Achan did? There's a lot of speculation that we can go through, and that might be interesting. It seems pretty probable that Achan's family knew what he did. It's pretty hard to hide that amount of gold and silver, bringing it back into their spacious 5-room tent, right? But he buries that underneath the tent, and obviously they're going to see that. I feel like that's pretty probable. But did the rest of the people know? There's nothing that says that they did. And it's possible that somebody saw Achan take things that he wasn't supposed to. It's possible that there would have been some sort of witness of it somewhere. But we don't need a whole bunch of witnesses, nor do we need the entirety of Israel sinning in order for Israel to become Harem. That's the idea behind this. That the covenant impurity of the nation has become a problem to God. And so the nation is going to face a punishment, even though this is Achan's sin. That doesn't necessarily mean that God is holding each and every one of them accountable for the guilt of that sin. But the consequences of that sin, the state of that nation before God has been affected. And God needs them to understand very clearly that you cannot go against my commands. This is early on in the invasion, early on in the conquest of Canaan, and the people are still a little bit shaky, it seems, on whose war this really is. So let's not be too disturbed by the fact that even though it's one man's sin here, that it creates consequences for a whole nation of people. Was there anything else you wanted to bring up about that, or anything we talked about last week? Gary.
I think even later when Israelites were taken captive, apparently not every single individual was to blame, or there was a remnant, right? There were some righteous people that had to go to Babylon also because of the consequences of the nation.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes we overly focus on the relationship that God has with individuals. That's important. I am thankful for the relationship that God has with me, and on a personal level, I need to be right with God if I want to be saved and if I want to go to heaven. But there's also something about the relationship that God has with groups. A relationship that God has with a group is not going to get you into heaven. It's not by being part of a holy nation or a holy church or anything like that. But there are consequences that happen when a nation has fallen too far from God, when God's patience has run out with the nation of Israel. Even the righteous people who are there get caught up in some of the consequences and destruction that happens within Israel, within Judah. Similar kind of thing today. God may not have exactly the same sort of relationship with America that he does with Israel. I can confidently state that that's not the case. But God is still the God of nations. And God still rules not just individuals, but also peoples and groups. And so he judges nations. He has a patience that can run out with a nation, even if you personally, as a member of that nation, a citizen of that nation, are right with God. And if you study the Old Testament, you see how those two things can still both be true. That's the kind of thing that we have here. Not every person in Israel is guilty of Achan's sin, but they need to get the impurity out of the camp if they want to continue to be blessed by God as a nation, as an invading force. There's some great connections for us as a church. There are a lot of reasons why we are to deal with impurity within the congregation. We love our brethren, and so we want that impurity to be resolved and for each and every one of us to be righteous. We are concerned about the impact that unrighteous people have within a congregation of drawing more people away from God and rebellion and impurity growing. But also, it's hard for the church to do good work and to be acceptable to God when impurity and sin is within the congregation and not being addressed. And so we will be more effective, more productive, and more pleasing to God when we maintain the covenant purity that he expects. That's mostly true on the individual level, but it's true in a larger level as well. Yes, Scott.
I'm just glad that God has the standard that he does, and that he doesn't overlook things, and he's not wishy-washy. So that means for us that we can just go about our work and not worry about things. We know if we do wrong, we have to go to him and ask for forgiveness. But we don't have to worry all the time. As long as we're doing the right thing, it's really clear.
Yeah. God is a consistent God. He has a standard and he follows it. He doesn't change it. If you've ever worked for a boss that can't be relied on, that constantly moves the goalposts for you and constantly changes or even goes back on what he's told you to do and says, no, I told you something different. You know how frustrating that is. You know how difficult it is to feel like you're doing anything productive or to be acceptable to that boss. God, as our King and as our Lord, is consistent with us. And so what we see here is strict, but it's not wishy-washy. It's not arbitrary. It's exactly what God already told them, and they have every reason to know why they are being punished. And that was one of the things we brought up last week, that Joshua's prayer to God is pretty bold in that he is kind of putting the blame on God. And we understand, but Joshua did not know that Achan had sinned. He did not know that somebody had taken these things that were devoted to destruction. But when God tells you, make sure to not take any of these things, make sure to destroy everything, and then to take these things and put it in the treasury of the Lord, and you see that after that battle, God is unhappy with the nation, God is punishing the nation, why is the first thought that God has done something wrong instead of somebody among us has done something wrong? That should have been Joshua's first reaction there, to pray to God and to say, clearly someone among us has sinned against you. Help us to find out who, and help us to purify the congregation, purify the nation, because we can't go on without you. That would have been even better of a prayer than what he actually offered. But God, to some degree, overlooks Joshua's too bold prayer and tells him, you've got a problem within the camp. It needs to be addressed. And God is the one who exposes Achan. I
was just going to say that's good. Yeah, I agree. But I still think they should have gone to God before they went to Achan.
Yes. I think so too.
Because even if we're doing wonderful righteous deeds, if we aren't appealing to God, we're doing it of ourselves.
Yeah, I think the difference is too stark between the two chapters to ignore that. Like I said last week, the commentators kind of debate on whether Joshua is being, hasty and going out on his own, or whether he is just jumping into the next task with the appropriate amount of zeal. But I kind of feel like Ida does there, that the difference is stark. Whereas before, it's God who's giving them all these instructions for Jericho. It's very clear that God is leading them. And then suddenly in chapter 7, there are no instructions from God. They haven't asked anything of God. And that's a hard thing to ignore, to think that that is just arbitrary. If they had asked of God, what do you want us to do next? Then there could have been opportunity for God to say, whatever city is going to come next, before you can go there, you have a problem within the camp. And then 36 people don't have to die. Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting. They postured themselves before this prayer. I don't mean to go too far. I don't mean to go forward. They postured themselves in a humiliated way.
Yeah.
God rejects that. He says, what are you doing on your face? Stand up.
Yeah.
And he's telling them, you have something to correct
Yes.
that you didn't do correctly. And it's just interesting to see that. But the other flip side of this for me, when I look at it, it reminds me of the guy who was killed for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And it's hard for me to think of the millions of people who are under the Sabbath law, that they never broke it again after that. And I think sometimes, and I know people don't like this, but maybe God is making an example.
Yeah.
This is the level and severity of how I feel about this, and you need to know this.
Sure.
And whether or not they did it again after this is unknown. But I think God does make examples. He makes exceptions to his usual rule of freedom of choice, and then you suffer the consequences. And this time, he makes the consequences immediately.
Yeah. Well, God's patience is, he judges how much patience to give. And I think you're absolutely right there, that in the case of the man picking up sticks on the Sabbath, God immediately judges that man there and tells them, you need to put him to death, you need to stone him, and they do. And that is God's right. And you're right. Does anybody ever break the Sabbath again after that? I mean, almost certainly. In fact, I can say yes, people do break the Sabbath after that because there's times in Israel's history that they don't really even know the law. They barely remember what they're supposed to be doing. They're worshiping God in either not at all or at different times just in name only and going through the motions of things. They had forgotten to make the sacrifices. They'd forgotten to support the priests. They'd forgotten to do all sorts of things. So in all of that time, they were keeping the Sabbath perfectly? Probably not. Yet not everybody was struck dead immediately. But again, in that case, if I'm remembering correctly, it was that God told the people, you need to stone him. It wasn't even God that struck him dead. It was, you need to do this. And that's one more symptom that later on the people are not enforcing the covenant that they need to be. So God letting more time pass and allowing people to rebel against him longer is an example of more patience. But a lot of times early on, there is that show of, I am serious about this. Don't mistake the patience that I will show more often than not as an example of me not really caring about this. I do care about it. I do care whether you take the things from Jericho that are devoted to destruction. I do care whether you are picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And when the people ask, what do we do with this man who's picking up sticks on the Sabbath, God basically answers, don't you already know? Didn't I tell you what the penalty was and how serious this was? What do you think the answer is going to be? Aaron?
Yeah, God told Joshua that until you take away the accursed thing from among you, you cannot stand against your enemies.
Yes.
And one of the lessons we have to learn about this is the reaction to sin and the urgency that you see in this chapter around how the people went about dealing with that. I mean, they responded to God immediately. They sanctified themselves. They called all the tribes and they went through the process to identify who it was. After Achan confesses, they run to his tent to discover the accursed things so they could remove them, so they could burn them and deal with it. We have to have that sense of urgency around sin in our midst, whether it's with us personally and our sin and how we have to uncover that and deal with it, or even in the congregation, in the larger setting of the group.
Sure. Yes. There is an urgency about sin. There's a danger of it that it needs to be addressed. And that's what God is trying to instill in them here, that this is not something that you can just ignore or be inconsistent with. This is important. And so I think that's a reason why this becomes a very public show of let's expose Achan. Let's show that he did take these things. Let's all see it for ourselves. And then let's all participate in the punishment that he has to bear, his family has to bear for this sin. That, going forward, hopefully they're going to understand much better that God really does mean business. So, yes, Catherine.
In Deuteronomy, when Moses was still alive and he gave the blessings and the cursings, I just can't imagine how Achan could do that knowing what God said about that.
Yeah.
And so, I can just imagine that God had to do this quickly and punish that tribe or that clan because if he let that go, and he already said what was going to happen, then there would be a big problem.
Yeah. And we noted last week that Achan shows no remorse in any of this. He does confess, and we think, oh, that's good. He confessed. He only confesses after he has been exposed and found out. And never once does he say, I am sorry, or forgive me, or I regret what I have brought upon my people. He says none of that. And in all the lead up that he could have confessed, knowing that he was going to be exposed, he waits until everything comes out. And so even after people have died at Ai, even after Joshua is praying to God even after the tribe and clan and family, or it's working its way down to exposing him. He just sits there, hoping that maybe somebody else will take the blame for this. It'll be some other person who's identified, and I'll be able to get away with it. So he is in firm rebellion against God this whole time. Aaron.
Yeah, I don't think we should necessarily judge Achan's heart in this, and how, if it was a repentant confession or not. But I have sinned and I am sorry. I don't know if there's a difference between those two.
Well, and I mean, the only reason I really say that is, a person who wants to repent. Okay, so you're right, Aaron, in the sense that it is possible for a person to truly repent, after they have been totally and completely exposed. It is. And sometimes that exposing is what it takes for me to come to my senses. And so you can look at Achan in that light, that he finally is sorry. I think the evidence is stacked against him in that regard, in that he only finally says, I have sinned, when God says, you have sinned. And I don't know. I think if you're going to repent after everything has already been exposed, the onus is on you to show that you are not just sorry about being exposed, that you are not just sorry about being caught, but that you are sorry for what you did. And so maybe that's true for Achan. I have a hard time seeing it, but it's not impossible. Regardless, at this point, he is past the point where he can get away with it. He is past the point where he's not going to endure the consequences. Even with his confession, to whatever degree it is sincere, at this point he has to bear the consequence of being put to death, because that is the judgment of the Lord. Kathy.
In chapter 7, verse 20, it says, and Achan answered Joshua and said, indeed, I have sinned against the Lord of Israel. If I sinned like that, that's not how I come to the Lord when I have sinned. I don't say, yes, indeed, Lord, I sin. To me, that's a little arrogant. I might be reading more into that, but that's what first came to my mind when I read this at home.
And I kind of read it the way you do. To Aaron's point, not a lot is given here from his words. So, you have to read in some level of tone. You have to read in some level of what you think he is motivating him. The pattern I see is he waits an awfully long time to finally say, yes, I have sinned. So if he is sincere about it, then he has waited too long to be able to receive mercy from the Lord, and that's a valid lesson. If he's not sincere about it, well, then it should be very easy to understand why he gets no mercy from the Lord. But that is the case sometimes, that even when we are truly sorry, sometimes there are consequences that need to be borne, because it's too late for this to just be swept under the rug, or just to say, okay, you made a bad decision, Achan, but let's undo it and move on. At this point, blood has been shed. 36 people have died. and he's caused a major problem within the camp. And so he's got to bear some sort of punishment. So question number 5 is write down all the people affected by the sin of Achan in chapter 7. I've given you one. It's easy.
Well, at least the people who died.
Yeah. That's, yes, 36 people. Those 36 people very much affected. And of course, the families of those people. That's a very real consequence, very real people who've been affected. Who else though? Okay.
All Israel.
All of Israel.
All Israel had stoning. Can you imagine if one of our members sinned, someone we love dearly, and they sinned, and we had to come out and throw the first stone and then burn them?
Yeah,
I think that would be a real lesson to me, never ever to sin.
absolutely.
Not
And
even to him.
Yeah, Israel has had this moment of their faith being shaken because there's a time that they're thinking God has abandoned us. They're kind of pinning this on God. If they're going along with what Joshua was praying, then that's kind of the way that they're going to be thinking. And that's a problem. Achan has caused morale to be shaken in the camp and for people to start questioning God. That's a bad thing. What else?
The sons and daughters.
Sons and daughters, yeah, family in general here, that his family and animals are killed along with him. We talked about how they almost certainly knew what he was doing and are passive witnesses of this, and so basically are judged as conspirators. But even if somehow they didn't know, then this is another example of them being caught up in the consequences, the physical consequences of Achan's sin, even if they are not immediately spiritually guilty of what he has done. Gary.
All the people in the neighboring countries, Canaanites, would hear of this also, the failure. Word seemed to spread both ways. The reputation of God's people, the reputation of God, even how would they take that?
Yeah, there's opportunity for them to speak against God, for them to think that God is not the mighty and holy God that he is. Most every person I know who has left the church and become kind of a militant rebel against God has a list of stories they tell about people in the church who did them wrong. And you know what? Sometimes those stories are real and legitimate. And it doesn't excuse them leaving the Lord, but it has become cause for them to speak against God. And I never want somebody's reason for walking away from God to be because I did them wrong, because I sinned against them, or they saw my hypocrisy, whether I've directly hurt them or not. That's one of the terrible dangers of sin, that you're giving others a reason and a license in their own minds to speak against God and rebel against God. That's going against exactly what they're trying to do in purifying this land from the people who have committed so much sin against God for so many generations. What else? Anything else?
Well, God himself, you kept saying over and over again, against God, against God, against God. And Achan's point says, I sinned against God. So it impacts people's faith in God, their belief in God, their trust in God, and how they live with God. The fact that sin occurs.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of victims here. A lot of people who have been wronged by Achan. This is never just about him getting some dishonorable gain. This feels like a very personal and private sin that's only going to affect Achan. Sin doesn't work that way. Sin affects other people. Sin spills over and hurts others, either very directly or indirectly, but we always underestimate it. That's just human nature. So Achan and his family are stoned, burned, and covered up with a dishonorable heap of stones, not given a real, proper, honorable burial. And the trouble, we have some more wordplay in the chapter here, the trouble that Achan brought on Israel ended when he was killed there in what amounts to Trouble Valley, the Valley of Trouble. That's what they named that valley there. And it's a fitting name. They commonly did that sort of thing in giving a name to a location based off of something important that happened there or important that was happening to them as they discovered that place. So the Valley of Achor is the Valley of Trouble. Okay, chapter 8. Victory at Ai. They're going to go back, and the trouble now is, now that everybody's morale is shaken, now that everybody is worried about, is there somebody else who has sinned against God? Are we, what is the proper thing for us to do? Is Israel okay to just continue? Or do they need to do something else? Is there something else necessary to purify the camp? Is there anyone else in the camp that needs to be exposed? This is a time of terrible uncertainty. And now Israel needs to be bolstered again. So question number 6, what does God tell Joshua once Achan's sin is dealt with? Verses 1 and 2.
Fear not, go take Ai.
Right. Okay. Fear not. Go take Ai. So now it has been resolved. Now you need to be encouraged and emboldened. You need to go and take Ai. I don't know if Ai was next on God's list to be taken before this happened or not. It's possible he would have sent them a different direction. Now Ai is on the list because Ai has been emboldened. Now they believe that they have overcome Yahweh, so there's the next target by now if they weren't before. So what will the people be allowed to do that is different from a Jericho attack? This is still in your question 6.
They can take of the spoil.
They can take of the spoil. What's the deal with that? Yeah.
Well, because in Jericho, when they took Jericho, God kept everything to himself. It was almost like the first fruits.
Yeah.
And with Ai, like Aaron said, they got to
Yeah.
keep the spoil.
So, I mean, is that fair? Is it logical? Is that okay?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes. And the reason being, right, I mean, well, that's the way God wanted to do it, so fine. Yes, that's the way he wanted to do it. Absolutely. You know, we get a little bit too full of ourselves sometimes and think, well, if it's okay to take from the plunder at Ai, why was Achan punished so harshly for taking it from Jericho? It's just plunder, it's just stuff. There's not anything different about the gold and silver that's at Jericho versus the gold and silver that's at Ai. But I think Kathy's on the right point there, that there's an aspect of giving the first fruits to God here. It's less about the gold and the silver and more about, are you faithful to God and will you do what he says? He is taking the first fruits. There will be plenty to go around. And you will be blessed if you're obeying God. Yeah.
I'm just going to say it's about obedience.
Yes.
Period.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We have a temptation to ask why instead of what when God speaks. You know, it's a good lesson for us to just say, what did God say?
Right.
And to not spend too much energy trying to think of why he said it.
Right. We are blessed that many times God gives us the reason why, and that is helpful to us a lot of times. But you know, it doesn't really matter. Right? It doesn't really matter why we are told to do things. You do it. And that is our great shame sometimes, that we feel like that before I will obey, I need to be convinced that this is a good decision. That this is proper, that it has to make sense in my mind before I will submit. If that's your attitude, you're not really submitted. You're only saying, I will do anything that sounds good to me. How is that different than outright rebellion? Right? That's what a rebel says. That's what an ungodly person says. I will do anything that sounds good to me. The only thing you're doing is dressing that up in some version of religiosity, in that sometimes the thing that sounds good to me does have to do with God. Scott?
I just like the word religiosity. It's just interesting that that's God's pattern all along. So it's not a new thing. So they shouldn't have had much trouble with the idea of that. Maybe they just didn't know ahead of time that he was going to give them the spoil, but they did. They knew that all the land was going to be theirs, all the fruits of the land was going to be there. So it just came down to patience to wait for God to give it to you instead of taking it for yourself. And I just latched on to the idea of that it's just not a new concept. So to go beyond that, that's our thing. We got to put God first,
Right.
and then He will bless us. And He's promised that. And you can trust those promises, but we got to be patient to wait for it to come the right way.
Mm-hmm. You know, why is it that when my harvest comes in, I've got to give the first of that harvest to God? Like, is there any difference in this grain versus that grain? Is there any difference in, physically, no. Physically, whatever grows is what grows. But there's a principle there of God saying, you are relying on me. You are giving the first of your life to me. And so it's about your obedience. There is plenty of blessing that is going to happen. They are going to greatly enjoy the produce of the land and the spoils of the land. But they can't go into Ai, they can't go into Canaan as a whole thinking that this is about them. It's about God. Mark?
Yeah, I agree with God says that we need to do it. But I would say that God doesn't test us. And he's proven himself already. And that is the driving force behind faith. Faith is because we have questions. God answers all those questions. You just have to be looking for it.
Yeah.
And in this case, we had somebody who didn't care what the evidence was. He just did what he wanted to do.
Yeah, God has already shown them that he will take care of them, that he is taking care of them. He's providing for them what they need. And it's escalating beyond what they need to even greater abundance. And so they should already understand that God is not just giving them the bare minimum, that he is richly blessing them. They should already know that they're going into a land that flows with milk and honey, and they're going to be richly provided for. If you're worried about God not blessing you enough, you don't understand how much God loves you.
Yeah, what I mean by testing is God will not tempt us.
You're right, yes. Yeah, no, I got you in that context. Yeah, Diane.
Actually, I was going to question that, what Mark just said. So God does test us. I thought he did, but he doesn't tempt us, which is true, because that's what James teaches us.
Yeah, God is not capricious and cruel, but he does, he lets Israel go through this time in the wilderness that is hard. And there is a testing that's happening there of, will they remember that God is the one who's taking care of them? Will they learn something from this period of struggle as they're eating manna and then later manna and quail there in the wilderness? That's a test, but it's not cruel and arbitrary. It's, he's not tempting them to sin because he's trying to get them to fail. It's the same kind of thing he does with us. Okay?
What we forget is everything belongs to God, period. The whole harvest is his. We're not giving him something that's ours. We're giving him something that's his.
Absolutely. And if we have that attitude, then it's easy to give him the first fruits. Question number 7, describe the nature of the attack on Ai. How does God give the victory? Yeah, through an ambush. That they're splitting the forces, sending an ambush force behind the city. Mark?
They send a lot more.
Yeah.
I think the fighting force in Ai was probably around 5,000 to 6,000. So sending 3,000 was an overconfident move on their part, I think, just my opinion. But they used the overconfidence. It's ironic. They use the same overconfidence that they had, that they haven't known that now AI has, and they use it against AI in that ambush.
It's almost like there's a lesson here about overconfidence and fighting against God. Whatever group, whatever army is overconfident and thinking that they know better than God loses. It's the same group of soldiers here. The same two armies that are fighting. Yet it goes drastically differently when you are being led by God. So yeah, send an invasion, an ambush force behind, then kind of pretend like we're doing the first battle again. An army goes out into a direct frontal assault. The men of Ai are overconfident. Everyone comes out of the city. Let's go ahead and crush these Israelites so they won't have to come back a third time. And they sound the alarm and retreat, and they're running backwards, running away and away and away from the city. And all that the ambush force has to do is walk right into Ai, set it on fire, and it goes up fast. It goes up in flames, and the soldiers of Ai are now caught in realizing, we've been had, we've been bamboozled. The city is on fire, and now there are, two armies that we are wedged in between, and it goes very poorly for them. Yes.
Do you know what how would you not be able to see 30,000 people hiding, or what, how do they hide, or is there any details about that?
Yes, this area has a lot of ridges and valleys, a lot of elevation change here. So they're able to kind of sneak around hills, around ridges, kind of through valleys, all sorts of things that provide more cover than you would think. This is not out in an open field somewhere. This whole area is quite rocky. That question is something like, how might you not see a bunch of people who are walking on the other side of Coles Mountain, right? Because there's a mountain in the way. That's how you don't see them. And that's basically what they're using. They're using the terrain to be able to get behind the city. And also, God is providing for them here. Yeah, okay. So it's total destruction. Everyone is killed. Only the king is taken alive. He's brought to Joshua. He is killed as well. He's hanged as a message to the people around them and as a dishonor to him. He is a dishonorable king. And Ai is burned and made into a heap of ruins. Now the Israelites are able to plunder as they were instructed, and they take home a lot of things as a result. Question number 8, what does Joshua do in verses 30 through 35 after this battle? Builds an altar. Yes. So using these large uncut stones, builds an altar on Mount Ebal, offers burnt offerings and peace offerings to God. He writes a copy of the law on the stones, read it to all the people as a commandment, as a reminder, as a challenge to them. This is a picture of maybe that altar. It's disputed. This is either Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal or it's a Canaanite watchtower. Sorry, I wish we could be more sure. The archaeologists dispute it, but that is quite possibly the altar let's talk about here. That's a little bit closer. If that's not it, it would have looked pretty similar to that. So kind of neat to be able to see that. Of course, it's broken down somewhat here with the intervening time that has passed. But the altar is constructed on Mount Ebal so that they're able to have this whole campaign centered on God. We just had a victory, and we're not going to make the same mistakes that we did after the victory at Jericho. This is about God. We offer our sacrifices to Him. We offer a peace offering to Him. We are going to follow His commands going forward. This basically serves as another covenant renewal. It's continually making this choice to not be Achan, but to faithfully follow God. And that's, this idea of covenant renewal keeps happening. Like, in one sense, there's not anything that's different. In another, it's setting your mind on what you have committed to do. Scott?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that there's nothing different, nothing new here. God's law still stands. And even though there's new things happening, you stick to what He said. And it's just neat the way He said, not a word that Moses commanded was left out, right? So, everything God's been saying and continues to say is the important stuff.
Yeah. It's a little bit like when you hear people are renewing their marriage vows. Is there anything really different about the covenant, about the commitment that they have with each other? No, but sometimes like that reminder that renewal of saying, hey, we're still in this, we're still doing this, we're going to persevere all the way through because this is good. That's kind of what they're doing. There are no people. All right, thank you, everybody. Next week, Lord willing, we'll move on to the next lesson.